Have you ever wondered what happens when faith collides with just a massive multi-billion-dollar economy?
Right, because it's never as simple as just people praying in the desert.
Exactly. Today, we are taking you back to 33 AD, but absolutely not for a Sunday school lesson. We're looking at an ancient world operating like a modern, ruthless corporate superpower.
Yeah, it really is a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. We are diving into a stack of materials that will, frankly, completely upend how you might view one of the most foundational periods in human history.
Because we usually paint this era in purely spiritual or theological colors,
Hmm.
like halos, parables, quiet prayers.
Right, very serene.
Yeah, serene. But the materials we are examining today, specifically this really provocative collection of writings collectively known as the Religion of the Gray series
Hmm.
and the Epic of Saul Saga, they force us to look at the exact same events through a completely different lens.
The cold, hard lens of economics, political leverage, and corporate monopoly.
Exactly.
And before we get into the weeds here, I want to be incredibly clear with you right out of the gate. We are not here to take sides or, endorse these specific viewpoints.
Or attack anyone's personal faith.
Absolutely not. You might find some of this shocking, or you might find it incredibly clarifying. But our mission for this deep dive is simply to impartially unpack the fascinating, provocative ideas contained in these texts.
We want to explore the historical gray areas they present.
Right. We are looking at the mechanics of the arguments these authors are making, how they reconstruct early first century Judea, the origins of the movement that predates the word Christianity, and specifically the life of Saul of Tarsus.
Which is really where these texts make their most explosive claim.
Oh, definitely.
They ask this very specific question, like, what if the early religious establishment functioned less like a church and more like a massive corporation?
And if it was a corporation, well, it would need people to protect its bottom line.
Right. It needs enforcers.
And that brings us to the core mission today. We're investigating the specific claim made in these sources that Saul of Tarsus was originally a hired mob-style enforcer for a corrupt religious monopoly.
A system these texts actually refer to as God Inc.
God Inc., yeah. And we'll look at how his actions in that role shaped the architecture of the world we live in right now. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To understand why a massive economic rebellion started and why a guy like Saul would be hired to crush it, we first have to understand how the people leading that rebellion actually lived, right?
Yeah, we have to look at the intimate environment that shaped their worldview. If we want to understand the macro-level explosion that changed the Roman Empire, we have to start with the micro-level spark.
And in first century Judea, that spark doesn't happen in a grand temple or a marble palace.
No, it happens in the dirt. It happens at home.
So the authors of the Religion in the Gray series take us into the daily, gritty reality of a typical first century Jewish family. They specifically focus on the extended family of John the Baptist, Jesus, and James.
Right, and we all know they were related, but what these texts emphasize is the architecture of their daily lives.
Right, they didn't live in, isolated single-family suburban homes.
Not at all. They lived in a structure called a Bet Av, which basically translates to the house of the Father.
And architecturally, this was known as an insula, right?
Yes, an insula. Now, for anyone familiar with ancient Rome, don't confuse this with the multi-story, rickety apartment buildings in the capital that share the same name.
Right, totally different vibe.
Totally different. In rural Judea and Galilee, an insula was this sprawling, single-story compound made of mud brick or fieldstone. It was essentially a cluster of rooms built organically around a central shared courtyard.
And the physical layout totally dictated the family dynamics. I mean, you had up to 3 generations living, working, eating, and praying in the exact same footprint.
Grandparents, parents, unmarried children, all sharing the same hearth, the same cistern, the same daily struggles.
And when a son married, he didn't, pack up a U-Haul and buy a starter home across town.
No, he literally just built an addition.
Oh, wow. Just tacked another room on.
Exactly. He would physically construct a new room onto the existing family compound, expanding the perimeter to bring his new bride into the fold. So you have this incredibly dense, overlapping living experience.
There are no secrets in an insula.
None. You hear every argument, you share every meal, and most importantly for our deep dive, you process your faith collectively.
Okay, so the texts highlight a crucial genealogical detail that really sets the stage here. Mary, the mother of Jesus and James, and Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, were first cousins.
Right.
This means these key historical figures, John, Jesus, James, were raised in this exact type of incredibly close-knit intergenerational structure.
But they weren't just a regular family.
Right. They were guided by Zechariah, John's father.
Yes, who was an established priest. And this is where the authors draw a really fascinating line between a religious family and a faith-focused family.
It's an important distinction to make.
It is. Because a religious family might, attend the synagogue, follow the cultural rules, participate in the community festivals. It's habitual.
Right. Checking the boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a faith-focused family, especially one anchored by a priest who deeply understands the inner mechanics of the theology, they live and breathe the text.
So Zechariah would have been the patriarch of their religious education.
100%. John, Jesus, and James would have learned the Torah together, debated the prophets together, and really processed their spiritual identities together right there in the shared dirt courtyard of that compound.
I'm picturing it like growing up in a very intense, modern family business. Except the business isn't a restaurant or a hardware store. The business is their absolute devotion to God.
That's a great analogy.
You are all working together, sharing resources, relying on each other for survival. But here is where the economics come crashing in.
Right. The real world intrudes.
Imagine growing up in that tight-knit family, and you watch your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your priestly patriarch constantly getting squeezed and extorted by a corrupt local government or a neighborhood mob.
That is the exact friction the texts focus on. Because they live in such close proximity, they didn't just share meals, they shared financial devastation.
And the authors describe a highly specific, visceral scenario to illustrate this, don't they?
They do. They ask us to picture this family taking a lamb to the temple for a mandatory sacrifice.
And let's be clear about what a lamb means to a first-century rural family. This isn't just a pet.
Not at all.
It's a massive investment of time, resources, and emotional energy. They birthed it, fed it, protected it from predators, kept it perfectly unblemished according to the law.
It represents a significant portion of their net worth.
Precisely. So they take this pristine lamb to the temple in Jerusalem to fulfill their religious obligation. But when they arrive at the massive complex, the priests don't just accept the lamb.
No, because the system dictates that you cannot use an outside animal.
Right, because it hasn't been deemed ritually pure by the temple authorities.
Right, so you have to buy a clean lamb from the temple's own approved flocks.
But you can't just barter your lamb for their lamb. And you can't use regular Roman coins.
No, you must use the official temple currency, the Tyrian shekel.
The Tyrian shekel.
Yeah, and it was mandated because of its exceptionally high silver content, usually over 90% pure silver.
So first, you have to sell your perfect lamb to the temple buyers.
But they don't give you market value.
Of course not.
The texts describe this exchange as notoriously predatory. They might give you only half of what the lamb is actually worth, and they pay you in local currency.
And then you have to take that local currency to the money changers to buy Tyrian shekels, paying an exorbitant exchange rate fee.
Exactly. And finally, you use those Tyrian shekels to buy the clean lamb from the priests at a massive markup.
Wait, so if they're paying in Tyrian shekels, a coin originally minted in the city of Tyre, which literally had the image of a pagan god on it.
Melkart, yes.
Right, Melkart stamped on it. The temple is enforcing a foreign currency standard, completely ignoring the commandment against graven images, just because the silver content is high enough to line their pockets.
That is the staggering hypocrisy the sources point out. The religious elite found a theological loophole to justify using pagan money because it was the most stable, valuable currency in the region.
That is wild.
It is. The entire system was a labyrinth of institutionalized financial exploitation designed to extract wealth from the poorest, most devout citizens.
So getting back to the cousins in the insula, the authors are arguing that this intimate shared trauma of seeing their own family robbed by the temple,
Yeah.
like watching Zechariah, a man who dedicated his life to the priesthood, having to navigate and submit to this blatant corruption, that is what actually sparked their religious rebellion.
Yes. The Epic of Saul Saga calls this the vision of theft.
The vision of theft.
Yeah. It wasn't an abstract, lofty theological disagreement born out of, reading scrolls in a library.
Yeah.
It was a visceral daily reality.
They felt it in their wallets.
Exactly. The family was practicing their faith purely, beautifully, and freely at home in the insula. They prayed together, they studied together. But the moment they stepped into the institutional structure of the temple to fulfill their obligations, They were systematically extorted.
So they realized the institution was placing a massive tax on their devotion.
They recognized that the establishment had built a toll booth on the road to God.
A toll booth. I like that.
This collective realization, forged in the intense pressure cooker of the family compound, is what ignited the spark. John, Jesus, and James didn't just want to reform the theology. They wanted to dismantle the toll booth entirely.
Which brings us to the toll booth itself. Having seen the micro-level trauma in the family compound, we really have to zoom out to the macro level.
We need to understand the sheer scale of the financial machine that was extorting them.
Right. The sources refer to this machine simply and effectively as God Inc.
It's a very provocative title, but when you look at the mechanics of the Sanhedrin Council in the first century, it perfectly encapsulates their operation.
We all know the Sanhedrin from basic history as the supreme Jewish religious court.
But what's fascinating is how these texts strip away the religious veneer and recast them strictly as a corporate board of directors protecting a monopoly.
And let's look at who sits on this board. It's a 71-member body, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You have the priestly aristocracy, largely made up of Sadducees who controlled the daily temple operations and the treasury. You have the scribes and scholars, many of whom were Pharisees, who drafted the complex legal frameworks that kept the people bound to the system.
And you have the wealthy elders from a few elite families.
So it was an absolute concentration of wealth, power, and legal authority.
And they sat on top of what the authors repeatedly call a river of money.
A river of money.
This wasn't a modest collection plate passed around on the Sabbath. The temple system required those mandatory Tyrian shekels for sacrifices, for the redemption of the firstborn, for vows, and most importantly, for the half-shekel annual temple tax required of every adult Jewish male in the world.
Wait, every Jewish male in the world, not just in Judea.
Exactly. You had Jews living in Alexandria, in Rome, in Babylon, all funneling high-purity silver back to this single building in Jerusalem every single year.
That's unbelievable.
The sources estimate that the wealth flowing through this system, stored in the temple vaults, would be valued in the billions of dollars by today's standards.
Billions.
It was the central bank of the entire region.
Okay, but they aren't operating in a vacuum. Judea is a Roman province under the control of Emperor Tiberius.
Right.
Rome is the ultimate apex predator here. They are a well-oiled military superpower, and what Rome cares about is manpower, stability, and money.
They are in the business of harvesting humanity and resources.
So how does God Inc. survive under the boot of Rome? Like, why doesn't Rome just seize the vault?
Well, they survive by making themselves indispensable to Rome. The Sanhedrin is caught in the middle, but they are profiting immensely from the arrangement. The texts explain that the Sanhedrin used this massive river of wealth to relieve pressure from their Roman overlords. Tiberius didn't want to micromanage a rebellious, monotheistic province on the eastern edge of his empire. It was a massive headache.
So the Sanhedrin basically says, look, we'll handle the locals, you just take your cut.
That's exactly the deal. The Sanhedrin paid the massive imperial taxes, they kept the volatile population in check using their religious authority, and they ensured the tribute flowed smoothly to Rome.
And in exchange,
Rome allowed the Sanhedrin to maintain their power, their private temple guard, and, most importantly, their incredibly lucrative monopoly over the religious life of the people.
wow.
It was a highly symbiotic relationship built entirely on the economic exploitation of the everyday Jewish populace.
It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar international supply chain of faith.
Truly.
And into this perfectly calibrated, highly profitable machine steps a new radical movement. The sources call them the Sect of the Nazarenes, or simply the Way.
This is the movement led by the cousins from the insula, right?
Yeah.
John the Baptist, Jesus, and James.
Exactly. And this is where the conflict ceases to be merely a debate over scripture and becomes an intense existential economic war. The theology of the Nazarenes was a direct, targeted strike at the foundation of the temple system.
Because what were they offering?
Free salvation.
Exactly, free salvation. John the Baptist is the vanguard here. He goes out into the wilderness to the Jordan River, and he completely bypasses the temple architecture.
He just walks right past it.
Right. He offers baptism, a ritual of complete spiritual cleansing, forgiveness of sins, and a direct path to God in a muddy river.
No Tyrian shekels required.
No approved, marked-up sacrifices to purchase.
No priests to act as middlemen.
None of it. The sources emphasize that Jesus and James take this even further. They taught that a pure path to God could be found within oneself, through direct prayer, repentance, and how you treated your neighbor.
So they were explicitly telling people that God's grace couldn't be bought, and therefore you didn't need to engage with the purchased rituals and the monetary toll of the Sanhedrin.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mhm.
the economic concept the authors use here is brilliant. They describe the Nazarene teachings as boulders in a river.
Boulders in a river, I love that imagery.
Yeah, when you drop a boulder into a fast-flowing river, you divert the water. You drop enough boulders, you completely change the course of the river.
And in this scenario, the water is the money.
Exactly.
I really love this analogy because it frames it so perfectly for a modern mind. It's exactly like a massive corporate monopoly facing the invention of open source free software.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
Right. Imagine you run a massive telecommunications company that holds a total monopoly on internet access. You charge a massive premium, and people have absolutely no choice but to pay you because you own all the physical cables.
Right, you own the infrastructure.
And suddenly, a group of brilliant developers releases a free, direct-to-consumer, decentralized technology that allows everyone to connect to the internet without ever using your cables.
Your monopoly is instantly broken. Your revenue stream just collapses.
And you don't just sit there and applaud their innovation. The Nazarenes weren't just preaching a nice, comforting new philosophy to make people feel good. They were offering a free, direct-to-consumer salvation product that circumvented the corporate middlemen of God, Inc.
They were looking at a population being crushed by poverty and religious taxes and telling them, you don't have to pay to be loved by God.
Which is precisely why the Sanhedrin didn't view them as just annoying fringe heretics.
No, they viewed them as a catastrophic economic liability.
If you change the path to salvation, you completely sever the path of the money.
By telling the population they didn't have to pay, the Nazarenes threatened a multi-billion-dollar economy that kept both the Jewish elite wealthy and the Roman military at bay.
And when a multi-billion-dollar monopoly faces an existential threat to its primary revenue stream, it doesn't just write a strongly worded letter to the editor.
Definitely not.
It doesn't invite the founders to a polite debate. It sends in the enforcers.
Which brings us to a figure that history knows very well, but the texts present in a shockingly different light.
Enter Saul of Tarsus.
Yes. The timeline is roughly 33 AD. Saul is a young man, estimated by these specific texts to be around 28 to 30 years old.
So he's young, ambitious.
Very. He is highly educated, a Roman citizen by birth, a strict Pharisee, and he has been trained directly under the master Gamaliel.
And Gamaliel is one of the most respected, powerful, and politically connected rabbis sitting on the Sanhedrin Council.
So Saul's the ultimate insider. He is Gamaliel's star protege. He knows the law, he knows the politics, and, well, he knows where the bodies are buried.
He has a seat very close to the head of the table. But the Epic of Saul doesn't describe him as a quiet scholar sitting in a dusty library debating the finer points of Torah law.
No, they define his true functional role as a high-level cleaner or a hitman for God, Inc.
A hitman?
Yes, his explicit mission, mandated and funded by the council, was to hunt, track, and decimate the followers of the way.
The sources do not mince words here at all. They compare Saul's role to an enforcer for an organized crime syndicate, like a first-century murder inc.
The Sanhedrin had their own specialized hit squad to deal with severe economic liabilities, and Saul was the man leading it.
His job was to protect the river of money by making terrifying, brutal public examples of anyone who challenged the toll booth.
And we see the mechanics of this clearly in his involvement with a man named Stephen.
Right. Biblical history remembers Stephen as the first Christian martyr, a man stoned for his faith.
But the texts point out that Stephen was targeted specifically because he was highly effective. He was performing wonders, but more importantly, he was engaging in brilliant public debates that successfully challenged Jewish customs and explicitly threatened the necessity of the physical temple system.
He was a massive boulder in the river.
Exactly. And Saul wasn't just a casual bystander who happened to be holding the coats of the people throwing the stones.
The authors argue that Saul was acting as the commanding officer. He was jury and executioner for Stephen. He was wielding the lethal authority of the Sanhedrin to neutralize a financial threat.
Which leads us to one of the most heavily analyzed events in history, the trip to Damascus.
Oh, yes. For anyone familiar with the traditional narrative, the road to Damascus is the ultimate story of spontaneous spiritual awakening.
The blinding light, the voice from heaven, the total transformation from persecutor to apostle.
But the Religion in the Gray series completely reframes the logistics and the intent of this journey.
I have to say, looking at the logistical breakdown in these texts is fascinating.
It really is.
They argue that the Damascus trip was not a spiritual retreat, It certainly wasn't a solo journey of self-discovery. It was a highly premeditated, heavily resourced hit order.
Look at the sheer scale of the operation described in the texts. They point out that Saul was traveling with wagons.
He was traveling with a large armed party, likely temple guards.
He was carrying official letters of extradition from the high priest.
He had the full official backing, funding, and legal cover of the Sanhedrin Council. He was operating with zero fear of local reprisal.
And let's be real, you do not organize a multi-week, massive logistical convoy simply to go argue theology with a few dissidents in another city.
Exactly. You take wagons because you are planning to bring a lot of people back in chains.
It's an extraction team.
Yes, the texts call this mission a public advertisement for power. The Nazarenes were spreading rapidly, the free salvation model was going viral, and Saul was sent to a major economic hub like Damascus to violently rip the movement out by its roots before it could establish a permanent foothold outside of Judea.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let me challenge this mob hitman theory for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
If Saul was this terrifying, heavily funded Sanhedrin forcer operating with wagons and armed guards to crush these people, how does he eventually become the most revered figure in the very movement he was trying to destroy? It's the big paradox.
Right. The sources use this incredible metaphor. They call him the Sheriff of Nottingham in the Judean forest, hunting down the outlaws who are bypassing the king's taxes.
Yeah.
If he's the sheriff, why do all our history books paint him as Robin Hood?
That is the pivotal question of the entire series. And the answer the authors provide is cold and practical. History is written by the victor. If the enforcer eventually manages to take over the movement, which we will get to, he cannot retain the biography of the man who slaughtered the movement's original founders.
Right. That doesn't play well for public relations.
No. The Sheriff of Nottingham narrative has to be aggressively scrubbed and replaced with a narrative of divine intervention. But when you look past the later theological spin and examine the sheer logistics of his early actions, the orchestrated stoning of Stephen, the heavily funded, armed expedition to Damascus with wagons and guards, those actions point squarely to a corporate enforcer neutralizing a financial threat, not a misguided theologian. So Saul is out in the field, kicking indoors, dealing with the followers, orchestrating executions like Stephen's, but the Sanhedrin board of directors back in Jerusalem has a much bigger problem.
They have the head of the snake. They have Jesus.
But as the texts point out, killing Jesus wasn't as simple as dragging him into an alley or staging a quick stoning. Jesus had massive public support, especially during Passover.
Right. The crowds loved him.
They needed a very specific, twisted legal strategy to pull this off without triggering a massive riot that would bring the Roman legions down on their own heads.
This brings us to the complex, incredibly delicate intersection of Jewish religious law and Roman imperial power. The Sanhedrin viewed Jesus as the ultimate blasphemer. He was teaching things that fundamentally subverted their authority, challenged the purity laws, and most importantly, threatened the temple economy.
And under Jewish law, the punishment for blasphemy is stoning, just like they did to Stephen.
Yeah.
So if Jesus is right there in Jerusalem, why not just stone him and be done with it?
Because a stoning is a localized religious event. It's often chaotic, and it can easily turn the victim into a localized martyr, sparking further rebellion among his followers.
It's messy.
Very messy. The authors argue the Sanhedrin wanted a much more permanent, terrifying, and widely broadcast solution. They wanted to make an example of Jesus that would echo across the entire province and absolutely crush the psychological will of the movement.
And to achieve that level of terror, they needed Rome.
They needed the empire to execute him.
But there's a huge problem with that plan. Rome does not care about Jewish theology. Emperor Tiberius is running a global polytheistic superpower.
As long as the taxes are paid and the trade routes are quiet, Rome genuinely does not care if you think a carpenter from Galilee is a blasphemer.
Or if someone is eating the wrong food on the wrong day.
Right, they had a strict policy of relative tolerance for local religions, precisely to avoid unnecessary uprisings.
That is the exact hurdle the Sanhedrin faced. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea, was known to be ruthless, but he was also pragmatic. If the high priest brought Jesus to him on charges of religious heresy, Pilate would have laughed them out of his praetorium.
It wasn't a violation of Roman law.
So we get to what the sources call the spin.
The spin, yeah.
The authors detail how Gamaliel, remember Saul's master, the brilliant legal mind, and the rest of the Sanhedrin orchestrated a clever cut-and-paste job on Jesus' rap sheet.
They reframed the entire narrative for a Roman audience. They couldn't sell Jesus as a religious heretic, so they meticulously repackaged him as a violent political traitor.
They took Jesus to Pilate and argued that he wasn't just preaching a new way to prayer. They claimed he was actively forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar.
And that he was setting himself up as a rival king.
They presented him as a direct insurrectionist threat to the power and authority of Emperor Tiberius.
It's like calling the FBI on a rival startup company, not because they stole your code, but by planting evidence that they are funding domestic terrorism.
Exactly. You take a theological debate about free salvation and you weaponize it into a federal treason case.
And the authors raise an important question here. Why go to such extraordinary, risky lengths to lie to a Roman governor? Why risk getting the Roman military involved in local affairs at all?
Because of the highly specific method of execution Rome utilized for treason.
The theater of terror.
Yes, crucifixion.
The texts are adamant about this historical reality, which often gets lost in later religious iconography. Rome did not use crucifixion for religious crimes, ever.
They didn't use it for common murder or theft?
No, crucifixion was a highly specific, highly visible theater of terror reserved almost exclusively for political rebels, insurrectionists, runaway slaves, and traitors to the state. It was a billboard.
It was designed to be as physically agonizing, utterly humiliating, and profoundly public as possible. You put the victim on a main road, naked, suffocating over a period of days with a placard above their head stating their crime.
In Jesus' case, King of the Jews.
It was a message to the entire population. This is what happens when you disrupt the imperial order.
So, if we look at the sequence of events, to protect their own multi-billion-dollar bank accounts, the religious leaders, God Inc., effectively swatted their biggest rival.
Swatted, yeah, like the modern prank, but deadly.
Exactly. They knew Rome was a legal, blunt instrument, so they called in a fake threat. They framed a grassroots religious reformer as a violent political revolutionary just so Rome would bring down the hammer.
So to protect their own bank accounts, the religious leaders effectively swatted their rival. They called in the Roman military by framing a religious debate as a federal treason case. That is just ruthless, unbelievable corporate sabotage.
It really is.
You don't just outcompete the rival startup. You convince the federal government to raid their headquarters, execute the CEO, and salt the earth.
And it is a masterstroke of dark economics. By using Roman imperial power to execute Jesus, the Sanhedrin accomplished two massive goals simultaneously.
Well,
First, they placed the final nail in the proverbial coffin of the Nazarene movement, ensuring maximum public terror and deterrence. Second, they kept their own hands entirely clean.
oh, of course.
They protected their wealth and eliminated the threat without taking the direct public blame for the sheer violence of the execution. They forced Rome to do the dirty work.
And it seemingly worked. The leader of the movement was executed in the most terrifying way imaginable. The followers were scattered, terrified, and actively being hunted by enforcers like Saul.
But the movement didn't die. It just went underground, and it created a massive power vacuum.
And this is where the story takes its most shocking, almost unbelievable turn. Because with Jesus executed by Rome, the original movement is in absolute shambles. The leadership is fractured.
And the very enforcer sent by God Inc. to destroy the movement, Saul, is the one who steps into that vacuum to take it over.
We are now looking at the era following the crucifixion. The original movement, the Sect of the Nazarenes, is now being led by James, the brother of Jesus.
And the sources point out a fascinating, deeply disturbing dynamic, an unspoken hatred between Saul, who now goes by Paul, and James.
The texts say James absolutely despised Paul. And when you look at it through the lens these authors provide, stripping away the later idea that they were all just happy apostles working together, how could he not hate him?
The logic is chillingly straightforward. The authors argue that it is statistically and practically impossible that a man of Saul's standing, his zeal, and his specific job description, hunting the leadership of the Nazarenes, was not present or even directly responsible at the doorstep of Jesus' execution.
It happened in the same year, in the same city, against the very movement Saul was officially tasked and paid to destroy.
James knew exactly who Paul was. James knew Paul was the hitman. As the text vividly puts it, James knew Paul had led the lamb to the lion.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. James is desperately trying to keep his executed brother's grassroots movement alive in Jerusalem, facing constant poverty and threat.
And suddenly, the Sanhedrin's chief enforcer, the guy who probably kicked in James's door a year earlier, claims to have had a vision on the road, changes his name, and starts traveling around the Mediterranean preaching a highly modified version of his brother's message.
It's the ultimate betrayal. But it raises a huge logistical question. How does Paul get away with it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Uh,
How does he become the most famous figure, the primary architect in the history of the movement, if the original founders in Jerusalem knew he was the guy who likely orchestrated the assassination? If I'm James and the guy who killed my brother shows up at a church meeting, I don't give him a microphone, I have him thrown out or worse. How did Paul survive the hostile takeover?
The sources point to a massive, highly successful historical cover-up, a deliberate deflection of guilt. They argue that Paul intentionally, repeatedly emphasized the stoning of Stephen in his later writings and the histories he influenced.
Specifically naming Stephen the first martyr of the faith. Oh, I see it. If Stephen is officially recorded as the first martyr, then the timeline of Paul's violence resets.
It's a brilliant narrative, sleight of hand. By elevating Stephen as the first martyr, an event Paul openly admits he oversaw and repented for, it acts as a smokescreen.
It distracts entirely from Paul's likely involvement in the much more significant foundational assassination of Jesus just months prior.
It allows Paul to construct a redemption narrative. Yes, I was a terrible persecutor. Look at the terrible thing I did to Stephen, while completely avoiding the catastrophic, unredeemable admission that he helped execute the actual founder of the religion he is now trying to lead.
He localized his guilt to a lesser figure to protect his new authority.
Exactly right.
Okay, so Paul deflects the guilt, pivots geographically away from Jerusalem, where James is based, and starts building his own following in the Gentile cities of the Roman Empire. But he doesn't just steal the brand name of the movement, he completely changes the product line.
When you actually compare the theological conflicts between James and Paul, the hostile takeover becomes glaringly obvious. Let's look at what James's original movement was preaching. Okay. The original Nazarene movement, led by James and rooted in the teachings of Jesus, maintained that Jesus was a man.
A remarkable, divinely inspired prophet, a light to follow, the Jewish Messiah, but fundamentally a human being.
Right. The absolute core of their message was that salvation is free, and that every individual has direct, unmediated access to God through repentance, pure living, and prayer.
It was designed as a grassroots reform movement strictly within Judaism, explicitly designed to bypass the corrupt, expensive temple economy.
And what is Paul's new, rebranded religion preaching out in the Mediterranean?
Paul reinvents the theology from the ground up. He completely deifies Jesus. He writes in his letters that the fullness of the Godhead dwells bodily in Jesus.
Jesus is no longer just a human reformer pointing to God. Jesus is transformed into a divine, cosmic being.
But more importantly for the power structure of the religion, Paul begins to teach that his own personal revelations, his writings, and his teachings are the sole authoritative path to understanding this new divine Jesus.
Wait, if James is preaching a reform movement for the poor, but Paul is suddenly building a heavily funded Mediterranean-wide hierarchy, Paul isn't just changing the theology, he's completely changing the target demographic, right?
He's making it palatable to a wider Roman audience who are used to divine sons of gods.
And he is removing the immediate economic threat to the temple in Jerusalem by taking his new religion on the road.
You've hit on the exact genius of the takeover. What's fascinating here is how perfectly Paul's new theology aligns with the needs of the very establishment he used to work for.
Think about it. The Nazarenes were a massive threat to God, Inc. Because they offered free, direct access to God, bypassing all institutions and priests.
Paul removes that direct access. He inserts a brand new hierarchy. You want salvation. You have to believe in the deified Jesus.
And how do you know what the deified Jesus wants? You have to go through Paul's teachings, Paul's letters, Paul's appointed bishops, and Paul's newly established churches.
He rebuilt the toll booth. It's a different toll booth in different cities, but he put himself and his new institutional architecture right back in the middle of the path to God.
Precisely. He neutralized the radical open source nature of the movement and institutionalized it. And the texts suggest a final devastating detail regarding how this was achieved.
What's that?
James's church, the original movement holding the fort in Jerusalem, was struggling immensely. They were facing famines, persecution, and they were funded by pure grassroots faith, mostly from exceptionally poor followers.
But Paul
Paul is traveling the Mediterranean on ships. He's establishing multiple churches in major economic hubs. He's writing and copying extensive letters. He's building a massive, highly organized global architecture.
and travel and communication in the ancient world were staggeringly expensive.
So who funded Paul?
Who funded Paul? That is the ultimate question the authors pose. Did the Sanhedrin Council, the Board of God, Inc., secretly back Paul's version of the church?
If Paul, their former cleaner, realized he couldn't destroy the movement with violence, but he could neutralize the threat of free salvation by hijacking the movement, changing the theology to a manageable hierarchy, and taking it out of Judea so it didn't threaten the temple's Tyrian shekel economy.
If he pitched that to the Sanhedrin, it would be the perfect, bloodless corporate acquisition.
It's like finding out the guy who orchestrated the hostile takeover of your beloved local startup is suddenly the new CEO, and his first order of business is putting his own face on the company logo, while secretly taking venture capital from the very monopoly that tried to crush you in the first place.
James must have been losing his mind watching this happen from Jerusalem. Imagine founding a free, open-source company with your brother to give power back to the people.
Your brother is taken out by corporate rivals.
And then, the rival's lead hitman claims he had a vision, takes over your movement's name, completely changes the product to benefit a new monopoly, and successfully writes you out of the history books.
That is the true tragedy of James presented in these texts. It is the ultimate, most successful hostile takeover in human history.
The enforcer didn't just destroy the movement, he absorbed it, completely neutralized its economic threat, and entirely reshaped it in his own image. So what does this all mean?
It means we have to look really closely at the narratives we've inherited.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey to unpack. We started in a close-knit mud brick family compound where cousins realized their family was being systematically extorted by the temple elite.
We saw them launch a brilliant grassroots rebellion offering free, direct salvation.
We watched the Sanhedrin, a multi-billion-dollar monopoly called God, Inc., push back violently using Saul as their sheriff of Nottingham, complete with wagon trains and hit squads.
We uncovered the political manipulation, the calculated spin that used Rome's brutal theater of terror to execute a rival.
And finally, we witnessed the hostile corporate takeover of the movement itself, changing a localized reform movement into a massive hierarchical global religion.
It genuinely forces us to examine the very foundations of accepted history. When we look at these ancient texts, not just as spiritual documents to be revered, but as records of human ambition, complex economics, and raw political power, the narrative changes completely.
It reminds us that history is almost always written by the victors, and the victors are usually the ones who control the resources and the narratives.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why a deep dive into the source material like this is so valuable. We all know the basic stories from history class, but exploring the how and why behind them challenges you to look past the accepted veneer.
It forces you to ask the hard questions. Who funded the narratives we take for granted today?
How profoundly do money, power, and the interpretation of events shape the reality we currently live in? And that brings us back to where we started. When you look at history, it's never a clean black and white picture.
It's murky. It's complicated.
It's driven by human motivations. So I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
If the foundational history of one of the world's largest movements was potentially heavily edited, cut and pasted, and hijacked by the very enforcer sent by a corporate monopoly to destroy it, you have to ask yourself,
What else?
right, what other historical truths, towering institutions, or daily beliefs that you hold today as absolute fact were actually written by the sheriff instead of the rebel?
It's a lot to think about.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the unquestionable.